The island of Malta is home to one of the world's greatest ancient mysteries. A 5,000-year-old temple dug deep into the earth. According to some, it was once home to an advanced culture capable of modern-day marvels.
When you go down there in the dark, you feel like you're connecting with the origins of civilization itself.
Inside, archaeologists discovered the fragmented remains of thousands of human bodies, including 11 bizarre skulls.
There was elongation. Some were missing the cranial knitting.
Since their discovery, authorities have seemingly tried to hide the skulls from public view, leading to some wild theories.
It makes you wonder why. What makes them different? Are they from another world?
What is the truth behind the mysterious skulls found in one of the oldest structures in the world? And who did they belong to?
These small islands hold one of the greatest ancient enigmas.
These islands are home to one of the strangest ancient temples ever discovered. On the Maltese archipelago, formed by the islands of Malta, Gozo and Comino, the town of Paola is a few miles outside the capital city. In 1903, archaeologists led by Emmanuel Magri began excavating a newly discovered buried structure. Inside, they unearthed a set of 11 strange skulls.
There must have been a shiver that went down their spine when they found themselves in this very strange, odd, underground place. But then in their hands, they were holding a skull that barely looked human.
But it wasn't just the discovery of the skulls that had archaeologists perplexed. The underground complex in which they were found was also groundbreaking. They named it the Thalassemia Hypogeum.
The Hypogeum is a real mystery, beginning with how it was even created by this Neolithic culture that just had stone tools, essentially.
Today, the Hypogeum, which means underground temple or tomb, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And despite a century of investigations, little is known about this impressive subterranean complex. Historian Silvia De Bono has lived on the island of Malta for the last 20 years and has closely studied the Hypogeum and its secrets.
Just underneath these normal houses lies the Hypogeum, 11 meters underground, a series of caves and tunnels. So if you were to drive by without knowing that the Hypogeum was here, you wouldn't even notice.
Yet its true purpose remains a mystery, and very little is known about the people who built it.
The first thing that really strikes you about the Hypogeum is just how modern it looks. I mean, it could almost be some kind of weird Art Deco building. It just doesn't look like it was built by people in the Stone Age with antlers and chisels made out of stone.
The Hypogeum is built on 3 underground levels, and as you descend downwards, it's like going into the belly of the world. It's incredibly claustrophobic. It's an ancient labyrinth with dozens of small chambers radiating off it, many of which are decorated with intricate and mysterious symbols that we still haven't deciphered.
The discovery of the Hypogeum found that this was a highly sophisticated, advanced civilization who incorporated not only brilliant stone carving techniques, but also acoustics into the design of their temples.
Within the Hypogeum, there is the oracle room, where the acoustics are so carefully refined that if you whisper in the center, it amplifies the sound.
Some people believe that it's built to generate 111 hertz, to be exact, which is the kind of frequency that apparently produces endorphins in human beings.
This has been proven scientifically that actually affects your consciousness. And so was that the purpose?
Yet few people get the chance to experience this astonishing structure.
Access to the Hypogeum is so limited and restricted that it's impossible to walk in from the street to the side.
The official reason given is that it's to protect the microclimate within it and the wall paintings, but it has made a lot of people wonder if there's something that's being kept secret.
While limited access to the Hypogeum has added mystery to the structure, it's what was found inside that has left scholars baffled for over a century.
The thing that struck archaeologists straight away was this film of red that's covered the whole space. When archaeologists started to get down into this red soil and investigate it, what they found were the skeletal remains of 7,000 people.
The remains puzzled them because the bones weren't arranged as bodies. They seemed to be distributed around the caves in a completely random way, as if there were no logic to it.
And among them is a group of 11 skulls which really defy explanation to some people's minds.
In 1903, archaeologist Emmanuel Magri and his team were able to salvage the 11 near-complete skulls. But soon after, research was brought to a halt. Sharon Sultana is the senior curator at the Museum of Archaeology in Malta, which houses the mysterious skulls.
Whilst Magri was excavating the Thalassemia Hypogeum, he was sent to Tunisia on another expedition. And unfortunately for us, Magri died there, and none of his excavation notebooks were ever found. It is quite a problem that we don't have Emmanuel Magri's original notebook, because those would have been the first excavations that were carried out, so giving an insight of how things were really found.
In 1907, archaeologist Temi Zammit took over Magri's excavation, and he made a startling discovery. All the ancient skulls were long-headed.
What do we mean when we say long-headed skulls? It's when the width of a skull is less than 75% of the length of the skull. And it's actually a very rare proportion found in the human population overall.
The multi-skulls, mathematically, they are so long that they are unusual because we know what the human skull looks like or should look like. It is off-putting for many people to come across a unique version of that skull. It makes you wonder why. What makes them different? Are they actually not like us? Are they from another world?
Unusually shaped skulls of itself is not actually unique. Cultures have performed head binding around the world right up until the 20th century.
Head binding, or artificial cranial modification, has been seen across the globe throughout history.
It might sound barbaric. In fact, it was a practice that had to be performed in the first 2 years of life, and the skull would be essentially compressed between boards, perhaps, and bound tightly with a piece of fabric. And this wasn't done as a punishment. In fact, it was generally done to distinguish the individual as special.
Head binding might be a perfectly rational explanation to long-headedness. Although only one of the 11 skulls shows a squash-like shape, a clear sign of having been head-bound. The rare skull structure could be a clue as to what long-headedness represented to this lost culture.
Given that one of these skulls shows an artificial manipulation to achieve the long-headed look, it raises the possibility that the skulls that are present in the Hypogeum were associated with high-status individuals in this society.
And we know that many cultures around the world, this was linked with elites, but also it could have had a practical purpose, and this could have been to affect the brain chemistry and the pineal gland. If If you're stretching it and moving things around in the head, it could produce different psychic abilities. It proves you're a semi-divine being.
More elongated skulls have been found across these islands. Further evidence for their purpose could lie in the sites where these anomalies were found, including one of the oldest structures on Earth. What can these mysterious skulls reveal about this lost civilization?
Malta is actually home to some of the very oldest ritual building that we've ever identified in the world, temples that stretch back to 6,000 years and are incredibly sophisticated in their construction.
Although a handful of the ancient megalithic temples have been identified, remains from dozens more structures can be found across Malta and Gozo.
There are megalithic structures all over Europe, but it's the fact that there's so many on Malta in such a small space that makes one wonder whether this island has some kind of sacred significance.
Gigantea, on the small island of Gozo, is the oldest recorded structure on the Maltese archipelago.
This temple was built by the same people who built the Hypogeum, and these are what we call the temple people. These temples, they're older than the pyramids of Egypt. They're older than Stonehenge in England. And at that time, there were no tools, no machinery that we know today for these people to cut the stone from the quarry, to transport it here, and to put these boulders that weigh probably 50 tons or more up here for us to see after 5,000 years.
We have to remember that we're only seeing the bare bones of the structures on Malta and Gozo. We're just seeing virtually nothing of what was there. They would have been much taller, much grander, much more precision engineered. The limestone would have been precise and smooth and perfectly cut.
The most amazing thing for me is that these stones are not held together by cement, but actually they are put on one on top of the other by pressure. So if you were to take out one of these boulders, most probably the whole wall would crumble.
Erected with nothing more than wood and stone tools, these buildings would have required a mass effort from the population.
Relatively speaking, Gozo is pretty small. The population today is only 32,000 people. So if we go back to when the temple was built, it would almost certainly have been a communal effort of virtually everybody on the island.
Although built hundreds of years earlier, the layout of Gigantea seems to have inspired the curved configuration of the Hypogeum, the last of the temples to have been built on these islands.
There's a walkway, there's chambers, there's an altar in a very regular location. And what's really fascinating is when researchers examine the Hypogeum, in comparison, there were a lot of similar features found.
You can find here some of the spiral decorations carved out by these people. These spiral decorations are also found in the Hypogeum in Thalassemia, and probably they are symbolizing the continuity of life.
A serpent depiction was originally found at the entrance to Gigantea. In fact, these snake-like spirals adorn all of the remaining Maltese temples. Perhaps it was an important symbol to this ancient culture. Because written documentation doesn't exist from this time period, clues found inside the temple walls are open to interpretation.
There are some evidence found around some other temples that might shed a light on these rituals performed here.
Artifacts that were found in the Hypogeum include a beautiful statue of a woman reclining as if she were sleeping.
The sleeping lady has often been interpreted as representing the goddess of fertility, an important deity for the temple people.
We can always imagine that if these people, at one point, they were worshipping the goddess of fertility, most probably they would have performed such rituals as orgies in these temples.
Another common hypothesis is that the sleeping lady personifies death and the eternal. This might explain the ancient remains found near the temple site of Gigantea.
500 yards away from the temple, 30 more long-headed skulls were found. That goes to show that long-headed people probably were around everywhere in this archipelago.
So who was this ancient population that built these astonishing structures? And were they all long-headed?
The human cranium has a general shape which is universal. Within the human population at large, that's going to vary between extremes, with certain shapes prevailing and having a genetic propensity to be passed on in a given community. And to me, that's enough to explain the presence of these long-headed skulls.
Malta, of course, is an island that would have created a population that was relatively inbred. So if there was a characteristic trait, it would be accentuated in that sort of an environment.
But many people in Malta believe there is more to it. Taxi driver Emilio Persiano knows every corner of these islands. According to him, some claim that the sophistication of the temple structures, along with the skulls found at the Hypogeum, can only be attributed to otherworldly beings.
Many people, especially my grandmother, always say the skulls could be aliens, yes. Malta is a very mysterious place. Many things, many temples in Malta, especially the Hypogeum, they think that it was built from the aliens. I don't know because I'm 50 years old, but the story is always the same. Aliens that were here before, a long time ago.
Hoping to solve this mystery once and for all, Dr. Anton Mifsud, a paediatrician by profession, has spent the last 36 years investigating the Hypogeum's elongated skulls. It all started when one skull, named Saphalini 11, sparked his interest.
When I saw the skulls for the first time, I was fascinated by Saphalini number 11. The skull number 11 was a mystery to me because I could not explain it.
Anton possibly knows more about these skulls than any other person alive, and is one of the few experts to have attempted to provide an explanation for their strange appearance.
In 1985, my father gave me a camera, and I wanted to try it on, and I was interested in the museum, so I went. There were 6 skulls being displayed, and there was this particular one which struck me. It had these huge orbital bosses here. And I photographed it from all angles, and I thought I would study it. Well, as a medical doctor, we're different from archaeologists. We spent about 2 years of our lives just studying the anatomy, so we know the skull inside out. So whenever I see something that is far out of the ordinary, I mean, you're amazed. Why were our ancestors in this shape? What made them have this shape? I mean, why are their foreheads so pronounced?
Today, the skulls are housed at the Museum of Archaeology. But that's not the full story.
Initially, there were 11 skulls, so we don't know when the number started to dwindle. But certainly, between 1955 and between 59, there was no real Museum of Archaeology. There was a transitional phase. Now, during that time, 5 went missing. We don't know why. In my view, there were a lot of undesirable specimens that were taken off the radar. They just disappeared.
Anton has never had the chance to study the 5 missing skulls. Just getting access to the remaining 6 was difficult and required him to work around years of red tape.
After the photographs I had taken, they were taken off the shelves of the museum where they were displayed. Access was totally impossible.
There was this whole debate going on about having human remains on display in museums. So I think the authorities back then wanted to be cautious, and they, removed all the skeletal material which was on display, and they put it in storage.
I published this photograph of these skulls, 1999, and after that, there were a number of people who were interested and who tried to get access to them to see this long-headed skull.
It was clear from the photos published by Anton that the skulls looked strangely elongated. Combined with limited access, it added fuel to the fire.
Theories started to come up. Were there aliens? Were they from another continent?
The Maltese authorities have been very protective, shall we say, about these skulls. And really, the more they do that, the more they're engendering suspicion and mistrust.
That was disturbing the prevailing paradigm of the time. And they wouldn't have that happening.
So could it be that the authorities are just too terrified to find out that human history may have to be rewritten? Could these skulls be an absolute revelation as to who we are and where we came from?
It's only been in the past decade that the skulls have been made accessible for viewing. But speculation continued.
People coming to the museum to see these Thalassemia Hypogeum skulls were expecting to see long head-bound skulls. But in reality, the skulls are what they are. So people started saying that the museum was hiding the real skulls from the Hypogeum, and the government is making us hide them for security reasons. What we have tried to do is study these skulls and give access to the public so that then people can decide for themselves.
Today, Anton is working with the National Museum of Archaeology in Malta to further scientific research into the skulls and get to the bottom of who their Maltese ancestors really were. But why are these remains so strange? Anton's medical background has helped him uncover some of the truths behind their appearance.
Now, this is Saflini number 11, and I think it was responsible for all the various theories of aliens. It possesses certain anatomical features which are not usually present on a normal human. Now, chief among which was the long-headedness. It's one of the most long heads of the Hypogeum skulls. Apart from that, it does not possess a sagittal suture here, which is normally present in skulls.
Because the skull develops at the same rate over the person's lifetime, it's very odd to find a skull with one suture still prominent, but the other not visible.
How is this possible? Are there any scientific explanations for this strange skull?
On a skull, the cranial sutures are the lines that one usually sees. One goes from left to right over the top of the skull, and the other goes from that line all the way down to the back.
When a baby is born, the plates that form the cranium have not yet fused, making the sutures clearly visible.
But as the plates fuse, the lines become less and less distinct. So in much older people, the lines can almost have disappeared.
Remarkably, on skull number 11, the coronal suture from left to right is evidently open, but the sagittal suture from top to bottom is absent. In extremely rare instances, one suture can fuse early, such as when a skull is headbound in infancy. But head binding only accounts for some of the skull's anomalies. For the rest, Anton has another explanation, which lies in a medical condition called thalassemia.
Thalassemia means anemia of the Mediterranean. It's a disease in response to malaria. What happens in malaria is that mosquito bites the human being and injects the baby malaria parasites inside his bloodstream, and they mature inside the red cells of the human. A red cell will last 120 days before it's destroyed. So that gives the parasites sufficient time to grow, mature, burst, and then cause the malaria.
To counter this process, the body has adapted and produced another sort of red cell known as hemoglobin F. It will cause red cells to break up earlier, preventing the parasite from maturing inside them and killing the infected individual. But to counterbalance the rapid destruction of red cells, the body has to produce more and more of them. This process takes place inside the bone marrow.
If you go to the front of the skull, you will see that there are very prominent eyebrows there, which reflect a higher degree of blood regeneration.
Because the increase of blood cells in the bone marrow causes it to expand and thicken, some of the facial features will become more prominent. According to Anton's observations, all the remaining skulls from the Hypogeum show evidence of thalassemia. Although thalassemia does not explain long-headedness, it does explain some of the features of the skulls, particularly on skull number 11.
He would certainly have had an appearance that was really noticeable. He would have a large skull. He would have very prominent eyebrows here, very high cheekbones. The eyes would therefore be deeply inset because of the jaundice associated with the breakdown of the red cells. He would also be yellow. He would have been weak because of the rapid turnover of red cells.
Further scientific analysis carried out on a Neolithic skull confirmed Anton's theory that the disease was present on the islands at the time.
Now we're looking here at a skull, a normal skull of a 5,000-year-old individual. Now this is where the blood is formed. But with a thalassemic patient, the width is comparatively larger.
Surprisingly, Anton believes that this disease may have been an asset for those individuals affected.
They had no physical strength, but they had the brains. Their brains were receiving a lot of blood, and they might have been in a better position to use their brains, so they were the masterminds. I believe that the people with thalassemia, with their striking features, were enrolled as serpent priests. The serpent priest was basically the communication between the divine and the human. They were the intermediaries.
According to Anton, these highly intelligent serpent priests, with their supposed reptilian appearance, would have been the ruling elite of the ancient people of Malta.
So what these serpent priests would have looked like is really interesting. We see some figurines that are actually on display in certain museums that show a kind of snake-like appearance on their face.
So what I'm holding here is actually a part of the skull of a serpent priest of late Neolithic Malta, 5,000 years ago. I made a study of all the remains of Neolithic people that I managed to find. Now, 97% of them were long-headed. But the elite I consider the ones who had the thalassemia, because apart from being long-headed, they had these striking features.
They had a mastery of things like medicine, astronomy. If we actually look at some of the carvings, even the 3D relief carvings we find all over Malta and Gozo, we see serpents depicted everywhere.
They were called serpent priests because part of their function was healing.
For pretty much as long as we know, the snake has been a symbol of healing, and it's even today used around the world as a symbol of medicine and pharmacies.
It also symbolized the link between us and the underground, because the snake slithers.
Were these serpent priests really as advanced as experts say? According to Anton, one of the Hypogeum skulls still bears evidence of these highly skilled healers.
One of these skulls demonstrated signs of a successful operation, and this sounds incredibly frightening for this time period.
The operation is known as trepanation. Trepanation is a hole in the skull.
Trepanning would be carried out because there was maybe some kind of pressure that had built up in the head, that the person was experiencing enormous pain. They may even have been having fits of some kind, epilepsy. And there was just a belief that by boring into the head, they may have relieved physical pressure, or they may have released, they felt, some kind of demon that was lurking within the patient.
As you can see, the defect here is underlined by growth of bone here. So this shows that the individual survived an operation that is considered today to be a dangerous one.
And just imagine, no anesthetic, no surgical conditions, somebody drilling into your head with a stone, age tall, a flint or obsidian knife or something like that, and you survive.
These risky operations would have been conducted by the Serpent priests inside the temples up until they were mysteriously abandoned.
So from the earliest times, the temple was used by the Serpent priests to effect healing procedures on late Neolithic Maltese, and also interpret dreams maybe, perform surgery like trepanation.
This Serpent elite, these were the designers and the instigators of creating all these ancient temples. They may not have built them themselves, they may have got other people involved, they may have got the local populace.
The Hypogeum is the last megalithic temple to be built. There were 3 zones. There was the zone for the public. Then there was the intermediate zone, where the public communicated with the priests. And there was the 3rd zone, which are only confined to the priests.
So, if Anton is correct, these skulls belong to the Serpent priests who ruled over the population. The remains of the temples they left behind demonstrate a sophistication beyond what modern-day experts would have expected for that time period. But why were no more temples built after the Hypogeum was completed? And what happened to the Serpent priests and the temple people? The civilization seems to have vanished without a trace.
The Neolithic people built the temples around about 2600 BC. These structures were used for over 1,000 years. Then something happened. These temples stopped being used completely. And there was a period on the islands where we think that there was no population. It could be that they depleted the resources and they probably had to move on, or a catastrophe of some sort happened on the island and they died.
Discoveries made at the Thalassemia Hypogeum might give us insights into what really happened.
They found a fascinating collection of Neolithic artifacts, but also the bones of what they thought were around 7,000 people.
It was just a whole jumble of bones, human bones, implements, pottery, all mixed together with no anatomical relationship between parts.
So how is it that the remains of potentially 7,000 people plus these elongated skulls were found in the Hypogeum? The jury's out as to what really happened to them.
Now, even the archaeologists themselves admit there was no evidence of warfare. There were no evidence of any disease that wiped them out, like COVID.
In 1907, when the excavation was carried out, Temi Zammit determined that it was impossible to accurately calculate the true number of bodies due to their deterioration. Yet, based on the number of bones found, he estimated that there could be 7,000 disjointed bodies inside the Hypogeum. But to Zammit's trained eye, the space was too small for that amount of people to be buried.
We don't even think it was a primary burial site. We probably think that the bodies were placed there afterwards. It was probably an underground sanctuary, which was then used as a burial place.
Since the place has 3 different levels, probably each level was used for a different purpose.
For Anton, the random layout of human bones and pottery might be a clue as to how the population disappeared.
During the excavation, there was only one skeleton that was anatomically aligned. Now, Temi Zammit described the posture of the person. He was not buried on his left side. This is traditional Maltese Neolithic burials. But he lay on his right side, and his hand, his right upper, was clenched, was flexed, and in this position. Now that, in medical forensic medicine, is known as cadaveric spasm and implies a very emotional death. And it's typically by drowning. So that would imply that the person who was the only one who was anatomically disposed was at the time inside the Hypogeum when flood waters came down
So could the drowned man be the key to how the whole population disappeared?
There's evidence for a tsunami. About 4,200 years ago, there was a tsunami which came from the northeast. And that is attested to by modern geologists. The tsunami came and whatever was inside the Hypogeum went down to the lower layers, and the people on the ground were wiped out. There was no trace.
Now we have to imagine that person in the Hypogeum at the point at which it was filling with seawater as the tsunami crashed across Malta. The terror, the realization you're going to die, the inability to escape from this space.
Dr. Zamet in 1907, he described it as a homogeneous mass of red soil that contained all these various objects of human bones and instruments and pottery. And that indicated what is called an alluvial deposit.
An alluvial deposit is a deposit that's created by water, and that could explain why we see the motley collection of bones and pottery in the Hypogeum. Because if they built up over time, we would expect to see them layered.
According to Anton, the bones of ancestors would have been initially displayed in the upper level of the Hypogeum, placed in a specific formation and exposed to the worshippers visiting the temples.
The floodwaters carried the soil from the surface. There were bones at the top being displayed there. The whole thing came down, and the person was down in the second layer and was obviously flooded and drowned.
Could this have been what happened to the people who built this complex? Despite the evidence, rumours of strange happenings continue to this day. Since the discovery of the Hypogeum at the turn of the 20th century, strange stories and eyewitness accounts have circulated, adding an aura of mystery to this ancient temple.
There's a story told on Malta about a group of school kids who went with their teacher to visit the Hypogeum in the 1940s. Now, this was a time when it wasn't as well organised with all the health and safety stuff that you get there today. And they ventured deeper and deeper down into the Hypogeum until they disappeared. Nobody was able to see them. Calling out to them resulted in nothing. They simply vanished. And yet some people say that for weeks afterwards, they were able to hear the cries of the children crying out for help, but nobody knew how to get to them.
It sounds a little bit embellished, if you ask me. You can't just have a number of school children and their teachers disappear in your heritage site without an investigation properly being made.
From the lack of eyewitness accounts, it's hard to know what really happened to these children and whether this is simply an urban legend. But this is not the only claim about strange things happening inside the Hypogeum. On the other side of the world, one Miami politician made some chilling claims about this civilization.
Bettina Rodriguez is a Florida Republican politician who claims that when she was 7 years old, she was abducted by blonde-haired extraterrestrials who apparently resembled the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro.
And these aliens told her about a Mediterranean island called Malta. And 30,000 alien skulls were hidden in caves in Malta.
There are countless claims of alien abduction in the United States, and one doesn't wish to be disrespectful, and I think we must take these claims seriously and investigate them.
Incredibly, Bettina Rodriguez's description of aliens seems to match another story, told in the 1940s by a young woman called Lois Jessup.
Lois Jessup, who was involved in exploring some of the underground caverns, which go further beyond the Hypogeum that you see today. And the story she claimed to have witnessed these kind of fair-skinned, blonde-haired giants inside the Hypogeum who scared her so much she ran out. So these are kind of connected, these stories, that not only are there kind of potentially humanoid beings who are giants living in the Hypogeum, but also kids have disappeared in there and never to be found again. So what do we make of these stories?
I think these kind of legend or stories are made as to stop people in that time to go down the Hypogeum.
These tales and legends might live on for years to come, but for most experts, credit should really be given to the ancient Maltese who built these long-lasting temples.
All of these speculations about otherworldly influence aside, these temples and the Hypogeum, I mean, they are absolute wonders of the world.
There is something quite mysterious about the Hypogeum. The way that this space has been created to house extraordinary human bones, these elongated skulls, they do tap into our innate desire for unsolved mysteries.
It's human nature to ponder about these mysteries, particularly when it's about our ancient ancestors that don't look like us anymore.
People tend to associate prehistoric people with savage cavemen. But from what we have on the islands dating to that period, we have a completely different picture. These people were people like us, with needs like us, with feelings like us, you know. They just didn't have the resources that we have nowadays. But in my opinion, they left us, Maltese, a legacy which we should all really be proud of.
Malta deserves more credit and more acknowledgement of its ancient culture. But the extinction of the Maltese temple culture was so massive that it's been totally forgotten and cast into oblivion.
Details of life that long ago can seem very out of reach, but archaeology, in fact, moves very quickly, and it only takes a few discoveries to unlock far richer contexts around things that happened in the past. So although we may not know much about them now, it is very likely that in the future we will get a lot closer to them and understand far more about their world.
With ongoing scientific research and recent technological advances, experts might soon be able to unlock some of Malta's ancient secrets. Until then, debates surrounding the mystical Hypogeum and the Neolithic remains will continue.